So massively interesting result in Sri Lanka's presidential elections. Anura Kumara Dissanayake, also known as AKD, the head of the JVP party, has become Sri Lanka's 10th president. He's just been elected, defeating Sajid Premadasa as well as Ranil Wickremesinghe, the incumbent president. So this is an extraordinary result for a number of reasons. Of course, the JVP, a party that once led revolutionary uprisings against the government of Sri Lanka, is now the government of Sri Lanka, and AKD, Dissanayake, its leader, the most popular politician in the country. So joining me now is someone you've seen on the channel quite a bit, is Aditya GS of the Observer Research Foundation, someone who tracks our neighborhood very closely and especially what's happening in Sri Lanka right now. Aditya, thank you so much for joining us here. Could you tell me a little bit about let's just start with Dissanayake. Let's start with the JVP. This was a party that just a couple of years ago was completely on the fringes of Sri Lankan politics, barely managed to get a couple of percentage points in any election result. And now look at them. They have won this presidential election, and Anura Kumara Dissanayake is going to be the next president of Sri Lanka. Could you talk to us a little bit about the JVP, how the party came about, and how it's just ridden to power in this latest election?
Thanks, Shashank, for having me. It's a lot of questions to be summed up in such a short time, but let me make it brief. What we saw JVP, in fact, is now, the government of Sri Lanka, as you rightly pointed out, was at a point in time, leading a rebellion against the government of Sri Lanka. The first such insurgency was led in 1971, and remind you, even before the Tamil Eelam and the Tamil separatist movement started, this was the first separatist movement in independent Sri Lanka, right? So they had, back in the day, they had a backing of a lot of urban educated youth who are also unemployed, and they led a strong movement, but it was eventually clamped down because also for the fact that they didn't enjoy mass popularity, they didn't have any strong support from any demography or any population as such, right? And following which there was a strong clampdown, the leader of which, Rohana Vijayveera, was arrested. He was released in the late 1970s. But then the movement picked up a lot of, attraction again when the India-Sri Lanka peace accord was signed. The India-Sri Lanka accord, in fact, where the IPKF troops were deployed in Sri Lanka for the first time, led to a mass, dissatisfaction against the government from a lot of people. And JVP was quick to tap on that anti-government sentiment, blaming the elites and blaming the existing government, blaming the government class and the elite class, and telling how they have ruined Sri Lanka for the last since independence. And they led the anti-government movement, the insurgency in 1987, and the momentum was broken in 1990. But nonetheless, it was one of the most dreadful years in Sri Lanka's history. 1987 to 1989 is when we saw JVP fledge its muscles in a strong way, and also challenge the Sri Lankan state in a way that it was not questioned before. Because again, in 1987, what we saw was the Tamils on the one hand, you seeing that Eelam movement was picking a lot of momentum. And at the same time, deep in the south, we were seeing the Sinhala nationalism in terms of JVP, Sinhala communist nationalism in terms of in JVP that we were seeing in the deep south. So this was a movement that was broken its back in 1990. Then it picked up its momentum again in 1994, made debut into electoral politics, into mainstream politics. Until 1999, they didn't have much momentum. In early 2000s, they had a member of parliament till around 11, 12 member of parliaments in early 2000s. But again, they were mostly seen as someone who were opposing any kind of peace negotiation, any kind of, peace solution with the LTT. So usually we saw them in tandem with the SLFP back in the day. Not with the UNP, because UNP and JVP have had a strong, antagonism that they were in practice since the 1980s and 70s. So what we saw was them coming up with an uneasy alliance with SLFP, acting as a pressure group.
Not to break your flow, but just for the audience, the SLFP and the UNP were the traditional two major parties of Sri Lankan politics. Of course, now both of them remain husks of what they used to be, but I'll talk to you about how two of the major Sri Lankan parties are no longer what they used to be. But yes, just for some context, the two parties Aditya is referring to were the two major parties that dominated Sri Lankan politics for decades. But please continue, Aditya.
Yes, so what we saw eventually was SLFP having an uneasy alliance with the JVP, and JVP were consistently pressurizing the government to not to have a peaceful resolution, not to have a peaceful solution with LTT, rather use a more muscular means. And that is why we also saw them get along with the Rajapaksas, at the later point in time when Rajapaksa became the prime minister and then eventually the president of Sri Lanka. So that has been their journey. They picked momentum, but they were usually dubbed as a 3% party because after that they couldn't secure more than 3%, especially in the last elections, despite going through consistent reforms. So what we have seen is three phases of leadership replacement in JVP. One was during the insurgency phase, and the second was, in the parliamentary phase, and third, what we saw in 2014 when Anura Dissanayake was elected as the leader of JVP. So what Anura did was, in fact, create a broader movement of left alliances called NPP. Is that alliance is what we see in power, of which JVP is the driving force. So in 2014, Anura went on to expand the JVP and make it into NPP and what it is today. Then they went on to contest in the 2019 elections. They couldn't secure more than 3% of votes, either in the parliamentary or in the presidential election. So they were usually dubbed as 3% party. But when Aragalaya happened,
So if I may stop you there just for a second there. So you sort of laid out the history of the JVP, and you sort of touch upon Dissanayake. Could I ask you, because there's going to be a lot of interest in Dissanayake, who he is. Could you also give us a sense of so you've talked to us about how JVP was a party that was broadly seen as extremist at one point in time, radical Marxist party that wanted to overthrow the government of Sri Lanka, radically change how Sri Lanka was governed. Of course, lost both those insurgencies. But under Dissanayake, it's become a force that has tried to become much more moderate, especially when it comes to issues like foreign investment, the private sector, India. And Anura Dissanayake, who's also known as AKD, is seen as really core to this process of transformation. So you were getting into it, but if I could ask you, could you tell us a little bit about Dissanayake? Who is he? How long has he been in politics? What does he believe? And then also, could you just segue into telling us how he's transformed the JVP into this party that was seen as extremist, but now very much has just won the Sri Lankan presidential election?
See, I think, again, look, let's go back to a bit of history, right? Dissanayake got involved in the JVP right in the early years itself, because his uncle, and again, I think this is quoting Indian media again, his uncle would be part of the JVP in the earlier days, and that's where he got attracted towards JVP and he wanted to lead the movement, right? And he was part of the insurgency movement in the 80s, in the late 80s against India. So we have seen him, right, take the JVP right from a very, anti-state kind of a view to now leading the government, because we have also seen that kind of ideological change within JVP. They have gained, I think there was an understanding after 1990s that they could gain more inroads into the country. They can bring in more kind of systemic changes that they desired by staying within the government rather than by staying outside the government. And this is precisely what a lot of insurgencies that get mainstream do. And I don't think JVP was an exemption to it. So Anura himself made debut into politics in early 2000. Mainstream politics in early 2000s. He was a former minister. Under Kumaratunga and Rajapaksa's time, he did lead. Even during that time, he did lead certain reforms and certain portfolios. But back then, he was also criticized for being too intervenist in its way, leading things in his own possible way. But again, back from that time to this time, what we have seen is a radical change in terms of its outlook, because there has been a leadership change. I think Anura sees more outreach doing benefit for the party. So that's why we also see NPP expanding its base, not only just within the country, but also outside the country. In fact, Anura had been on multiple tours even before the elections. India was just one part of it, but Japan, Middle East, Europe. He's been all throughout these countries wherever there has been a Sri Lankan diaspora, trying to mobilize them and get their votes, right? So I think Anura has realized that at the end of the day, he could bring in more changes that were desired by staying within the party and by leading a broader alliance rather than staying as an isolated leader.
So you've laid out who Dissanayake is very ably for us. Could you also tell us now, you're talking about the Aragalaya, just to explain to our viewers again, the Aragalaya is this mass popular uprising that you might remember from 2022, when there was mass popular anger at economic problems, at corruption that took place under the government of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. There was this massive anger that fueled an uprising against the government. President Rajapaksa had to flee, and after that, President Ranil Wickremesinghe became president. But since then, there's been a lot of economic trouble, a lot of economic pain in Sri Lanka over the last couple of years, as they've made some very difficult economic reforms. And in this period of time, the AKD and Dissanayake and the JVP have become increasingly popular, and it's been this 2-year process that has seen them win this election. So, Aditya, could I ask you to just talk about what's happened over the last 2 years that took the JVP and Dissanayake from being what you were saying, a 3% party, to now become the party that won the presidential election? What happened over the last 2 years?
See, what JVP called is a radical systemic change, right? That their whole campaign was based on the fact that this country is being ruled by families, by dynasties, by nepotism, by corruption, by elites who are, who have taken this country for a ride and who have led this country in their own way. I think this is something that had always been JVP's ideology. What happened during the economic crisis is we also saw a lot of JVP student cadres getting involved in the Aragalaya movement, right? Along with the other extreme left and other left ecosystems, they were all taking over, going to the streets, trying to spread this ideology that this country has been taken for a ride by these traditional elites. And JVP here was a traditional outsider, if you look at it that way, not from any mainstream parties, not from any mainstream families. So JVP in itself was an outsider force. And for what people were demanding after the economic crisis and what JVP was, I think there was a lot of, there was a significant overlapping between what JVP had to offer and what people were demanding. In fact, again, as I said, Anura had started planning to get into the presidency long before, his campaign started long before any of the other candidates, right? Because there was genuine demand from people for a change. That started from Aragalaya. And Anura, for a lot of people, was seen as an outsider. Anura, for a lot of people, was seen someone from the non-elite family who could bring in reforms in this country, in Sri Lanka, who could, radically change this corrupt and nepotism kind of a structure that had been formed for the last 6-7 decades. Right. So a lot of people saw Anura as someone, who could lead the country out of this crisis. Right. Now, Vikram, yes.
Yeah, you're very right. And just to add some context to what Aditya is saying, Aditya was on the channel. We just released his interview yesterday or a day or two ago as well, where Aditya was talking about who the 4 major candidates were in this election, and one of them was Sajid Premadasa, who is the son of a president who was assassinated. Namal Rajapaksa, who is the son of a president and the nephew of a president, and Ranil Wickremesinghe, who is of course also from an elite Sri Lankan family, has been in politics for 50 years. He became a minister for the first time in 1977. He's been prime minister 6 times. And then became president in 2022. So just to put into context of who Dissanayake was taking on in this election, the people he's beaten. So very much, the major candidates and the major parties were dominated, in fact, by families. But I'm sorry, Aditya, I was just adding some context to what you were saying. But please continue.
Yeah, so I think in this way, Anura was something that a lot of people looked upon. And Anura's, even if you notice his campaign, it was completely based on, I'm going to root corruption out of this country. I'll bring radical changes. I'll bring drastic changes. Look, economic certainty and stability was one part of it, which Ranil Wickremesinghe did offer. But I think people just wanted something beyond economic stability. And that is basically a change in the country's organization, a change in the country's running, and a change in the country's structure in itself. And for them, a lot of these people, a classic outsider would do the job rather than someone within. Because again, just for the just to provide a context, when Ranil Wickremesinghe was the prime minister back in 2015 to 2019, when he formed a coalition on the same background, saying that he will run a government that is against corruption, at the end of the day, a lot of people criticized him because they saw him as safeguarding Rajpaksas, right? And his corruption campaign met, disappointed a lot of people because there was no action, there was only rhetoric. Now, fast forward to 2022, when Ranil Wickremesinghe was becoming president, all he did was get support from SLPP again, right? Again, a lot of people saw that there is a significant overlap between SLPP, UNP, all of these politicians are part of one family, which is basically protecting against each other. And that's why they saw Anura as someone different. And Anura didn't join any alliances apart from the NPP he had. He didn't encourage anyone to join his side. He neither, and that definitely worked in his favor. For a lot of people, Anura was seen as an outsider. His populist campaign that he will bring in changes, and he's not part of that traditional elite, worked best for him. And people did vote for him. Again, mind you, a lot of people did vote against him to Sajid Premadasa as well. But at the end of the day, it was Anura who led the campaign, the presidency candidacy by 10%.
Understood. So we've talked about some of the background, what Dissanayake was facing, why he's become so popular. Now he's won the presidency. What are going to be the major challenges facing his government? What solutions has he advanced? The Sri Lankans want radical change, massive expectations on this new government. Could you talk a little bit about what he's planning to do exactly as president of Sri Lanka?
See, he's planning to do a lot, right? Just to sum it up, he's planning to bring in a radical change. But again, Anura knows where the country is right now. So I look, again, there is a difference between the narrative that you're trying to offer and when you're, when you're basically running for presidency and when you are a president by yourself, right? So now how much of it was rhetoric and how much of it will be reality is something that we'll have to wait and watch. But a couple of things that we would definitely keep an eye out for is his consistent promise on IMF, renegotiation of the IMF deal. Because despite Ranil Wickremesinghe bringing in stability, the country's poverty has almost doubled in the last 2-3 years because of the austerity measures and IMF conditions that were implemented. Now, JVP wants to reverse that, right? JVP wants to bring in a more feasible way of helping its country's people out reasonably. We can understand that, but also he wants to renegotiate with the IMF on how he wants to do it. So that itself is something that we'll have to keep an eye for, because there is a somewhat of a risk that it might derail the conditions and the negotiations that IMF and understanding that IMF and Sri Lanka have. That is one. Two, Anura has promised a lot in terms of inward economy, local economic productions. So basically trying to replace what Ranil had promised in terms of, increasing imports and promoting foreign direct investment. So there has been some kind of protectionist tendency, not completely, again, not extremely left, but we are seeing some kind of protectionist tendencies coming from Anura, right? Which might take a longer, which might have a longer implication in terms of its economic recovery. Now, third is in terms of his, political reform. He's trying to, at least in his electoral campaign, he has consistently mentioned that he will do away with executive presidency, and he will try to make Sri Lanka into a parliamentary system. So that is what we'll have to wait and watch, because right now what we see is Anura doesn't have a majority in the parliament. He has 4 members of parliaments, and now that the cabinet and the prime minister have resigned, Anura will be leading as the president, which means that he'll be left with 3 members of parliaments, and one of them will be prime minister, and the other 3 will have to distribute the portfolio amongst themselves, right? Following which he has promised that there will be constitutional, there will be parliamentary elections. So after that, we'll have to wait and watch if the parliamentary election, he succeeds in parliamentary elections, will he be able to implement these reforms, right? And another important thing, 2 important things that we'll have to keep an eye out for is in terms of the Tamil issue. He has promised reconciliation. But he has not promised the implementation of 13th Amendment, which India had been advocating for a long time.
So you've Aditya, given me a fantastic opportunity to segue into the questions I wanted to ask about India's relationship with the JVP. Now, if you watched our interview from a couple of days ago, Aditya, and if you read something about the JVP or know something about them, you know that they've had a very, very difficult relationship with India in the past. Some may say anti-India, in the sense that because they were, of course, a revolutionary Marxist party, they raised concerns about Indian expansionism, about the kind of power that India had in Sri Lanka, and they have periodically raised those concerns. So at one point in time, of course, they were fighting, they were vehemently opposed to India's intervention in Sri Lanka in the late 1980s. They did not like the fact that India was intervening in Sri Lanka's domestic politics on behalf of the Tamils. Just again, for some context, Sri Lanka has this major divide between the Sinhalas, who are one major social ethnic group, and the other, which are the Tamils. Tamils, of course, who have great ethnic links to India. Just a background explainer. And at one point in time, the JVP was seen as a very, very radically Sinhala nationalist party. They are opposed to making sort of agreements with the Tamils, which also made it very difficult for India to work with them, because not only did they suspect India, but they also did not like the fact that India was intervening on behalf of the Tamils to make sure that they have the rights due to them as a minority in Sri Lanka. So there were those problems as well. And just in the last couple of days, of course, you've had the JVP come out and say that, look, we will cancel certain projects that were given to Adani Enterprises, energy projects, because we do not like how the tendering happened. So on the one hand, you have this history and you have some suspicion about India. On the other hand, you have the fact that Anura Kumara Dissanayake himself came to India, met Foreign Minister Jaishankar. Soon after the result was announced, the High Commissioner of India, High Commissioner Jha, went to see Dissanayake and was one of the first foreign envoys to call upon him. And you can just see even today on Twitter that the Prime Minister Modi has congratulated Dissanayake. He has responded and said, "Thank you, Prime Minister, for your support." So there's two conflicting views here. Some people saying that, of course, look, there's a lot of history. Will Dissanayake be able to change the relationship with India, given how his party sees India? And others saying that, look, no, he has shown that he wants to cooperate with India as well. So I'm going to toss it to you, Aditya, having given all this context to help us make sense of this. How do you think the JVP is going to be looking at its relationship with India? Do you think some of the past history will get in the way of what Dissanayake wants to do with India?
See, I don't really think so. Again, for the fact that it has been decades, in fact, almost like 5 decades, that what happened within JVP and India, right? So what I sense is a sense of pragmatic approach from both the sides, from the Indian side as well as from JVP. India understands that the country wants a change. JVP is the best option, and JVP is here to stay regardless of whatever their past has been against India, right? The victory of JVP is completely based on its domestic politics rather than anti-India stance or the communist ideological leaning or whatever they want to portray themselves to be. So India understands that this is the reality that won't change. On JVP side, I think there is an understanding that India is no longer a power that it was 4 or 5 decades ago. It has grown exponentially. Its economy has grown, and to recover, economically, and to grow faster, and to improve its economic standards and living standards, I think Sri Lanka and Sri Lankans find a better option rather than staying with India rather than moving away. And I think that's where this pragmatism has kicked in. On Indian side, India has realized that JVP is a reality. On JVP's side, I think there is a realization that India is a neighbor that they can't do away with. In fact, as India grows, India rises, Sri Lanka would have the best of opportunity in terms of its economic integration and connectivity, right? Now, that was the point that I was coming to, the things to look out from Anura Dissanayake, right? This is the final thing, the foreign policy. He has promised consistently that Indian security concerns will not be hindered. Sri Lanka will not offer any kind of naval base or any kind of activities that will hinder India's security concerns. And on multiple instances, this is something that comes as a point of interest in the manifesto. They mention the word free, open South Asia, not Indo-Pacific, but South Asia, which is, again, if you look at it, it's a term that is taken from what the Western countries have been calling against China: free and open Indo-Pacific, free and transparent Indo-Pacific against China. But that is something that Anura Dissanayake has pointed out in his manifesto, and that is something interesting to point out. And I think, in my opinion, given the economic condition in Sri Lanka, given India's economic growth, and given India's increasing pragmatism, I think there will be an increase in bilateral relations. The mutual suspicions that existed 5-6 decades ago have slowly faded. In fact, Indian envoy was the first one to meet and congratulate Dissanayake in person. And there's also a possibility that Dissanayake might choose India as his first destination of visit. In fact, India had shown this leaning kind of when Minister Jaishankar was in Sri Lanka, he met people across party line. When Ajit Doval was in Sri Lanka, he met people across party lines. So we have seen that kind of pragmatic approach coming from India.
Right.
And I think Anura Dissanayake will continue to reciprocate to it positively. Yes, I do know that there was a project from Adani, in fact, the wind projects, the renewable energy projects that have been questioned. But look, again, I think this is a question that is coming more from a domestic point of view rather than,
an India focus. Right. If I ask you the question about Dissanayake and China, I remember we talked about it during the our last interview as well. And you had that point in time, just to refresh our viewers on what Aditya had said. He had sort of, if I'm quoting you correctly, Aditya, you had sort of suggested that, look, given the economic crisis, of course, you're going to want to work with both India and China, and there is no such understanding that Dissanayake will be particularly biased towards one country or the other. But I want to just ask you this question, right? That the sense is I'm going to make an argument. I'd like you to respond to it, which is that the Chinese put a lot of their eggs in the Rajapaksa basket during the 2010s. They invested very heavily in sort of elite capturing those very, very powerful politicians, and that worked out for them fantastically when the Rajapaksas had like a strong grip on the country. But since the fall of the Rajapaksas, they have sort of been in retreat, the Chinese, because the Wickremesinghe government, I think, sort of consciously tried to rebalance slightly between India and China, ensure that Chinese research vessels were not allowed to dock in Sri Lankan ports at least until early 2025 in sort of consideration of India's security interests. Certain projects were taken away from Chinese companies, given to Indian companies, and so on and so forth. So the sense among some people is that because of Wickremesinghe's political compulsions, he wanted to be seen as different from the Rajapaksas, and so he pivoted a little away from the Chinese. The argument I'm making now, or some people are making, is that now that Dissanayake is back in power, he will actually try to rehabilitate the Chinese more, allow them to come more from the sidelines back into the mainstream, and that might, in some senses, cause some tensions between India and Sri Lanka. Do you think that's at all the case? Do you think that China sort of coming back more into the mainstream, building that relationship with the Sri Lankans, given the fact that the JVP and the Chinese Communist Party have also had a good relationship over the last couple of decades? Do you think that might in any way cause tension between India and Sri Lanka?
See, again, this is a new government, and we'll have to define and redefine our red lines when we are interacting with each other, right? And that was pretty much the case with Ranil Wickremesinghe, and so was the case with Premadasa, or anyone who would have come to power. And I think this is the classic case that is going to be. Look, Chinese are not going to let go of Sri Lanka. Although they have mellowed down, I don't think they would want to let go of Sri Lanka because of its strategic crucial sea lines of communication, the investments they have already made. On Anura's part, I think he'll try to play for the both sides because there is a strategic leverage that both the countries enjoy with Sri Lanka. Chinese in terms of the loans that they have lent, and India in terms of economic recovery and assistance that it has offered. So Anura will try to play on both sides, no doubt about that. But at least in my thinking, he'll try to be sensitive towards Indian concerns. Is that because he has been consistently saying that he will not try to harm? Again, there is a difference between the rhetoric and when you are in government, and we'll have to see things. But look, one classic difference I would rather point out is when SLPP was in power, when the Rajapaksas were in power, the classic Chinese intrusion or penetration happened because there were institutional loopholes. There was no institutional checks and balances. There was no transparency. There was rampant corruption. But Anura is someone who has been elected to power on the fact that he has said he'll root out corruption. He will bring institutional reforms, and he will try to bring in some kind of transparency in every kind of bidding process, every kind of foreign deal that happens. So if that is the case, I don't sense the Chinese coming in a big way.
Right.
Because the Chinese have always used institutional loopholes as something that they could get into and make inroads. But if Anura is himself advocating for it, and if his constituency is advocating for it, then I think he will have to be serious about it.
Right.
And that in itself is a big challenge to China. Now, except for that, I mean, the Chinese will continue to exercise their leverage, and India will continue to push back against Sri Lanka. This is a phenomenon we'll continue to see regardless of who is in power. But Anura himself is new to power, so we'll have to wait and watch how he's going to balance these forces.
Right. And if I may also take the last word, just before anyone runs away and says that Dissanayake is also very pro-China, we'll also remind you that when the BRI projects were happening, the Belt and Road Initiative projects, including Hambantota Port, the GVP and the Dissanayake were actually quite critical of Chinese investments in Sri Lanka. But as Aditya says, it's something we're going to have to see how it develops. But thank you so much, Aditya, for talking to us.
If I could just put a word before you.
Yes, please, go ahead.
In fact, there's obviously this temptation to say Anura Dissanayake or GVP's Marxist leaning or communist leaning. But let's not forget the fact that they're also Sinhala Buddhist leaning. They're hardline Sinhala Buddhist, as hardline as they could be with the communists. So their resistance and their antagonism towards any country having a 99-year lease over a port is as equivalent to as they're as opposed to it as they are to their communist ideology. So I think these are the two factors that we shouldn't separate. We should always see them, shoulder to shoulder. And I think this will be something that Anura will continue to play on.
Understood. So Aditya Gaudara Shivamurthy from the Observer Research Foundation, someone who was, in fact, if I may reveal, was also in Sri Lanka very recently, someone who's seen what's happening on the ground, tracks what's happening in Sri Lankan politics, one of the finest young experts India has on Sri Lanka. Thank you so much, Aditya, for giving us some of your time and explaining what's going on with the election of Anura Dissanayake as the 10th president of Sri Lanka. And thank you so much, viewers, for watching India Today Global. We will keep tracking the story for you, as well as some of our other coverage today on Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the United States. Thank you so much for watching.